You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. Beginning year 17 of the show. We turned 16 this month. Of course, it's Leap Day. Very exciting stuff. I know a few people born on February 29th. That's got to be weird. You only have a birthday, like your actual birthday, every 4 years. That's just, it's interesting stuff. But what do you know? You got to take to the Gregorian calendar. It keeps us all straight. So there you go. We're having some fun here. But the topic for today is going to be really interesting and deep. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. We're talking about operations, and how you can optimize your operations. So, engineered for success is what it's called, optimizing ops. Ops, of course, refers to the work that gets done. We're talking really more about developers today and the challenges that they face, which are significant. Now, there are tremendous tools available these days for developers, and there are a couple different groups that we'll talk about probably. SREs, as they're called, site reliability engineers, developers who build the products that you use every day. Of course, every company has a website. All kinds of e-commerce happens these days. We're dealing with a whole new level in terms of scale. We'll talk about Kubernetes on the show today, one of the most fascinating projects. Hats off to Google for this one, because they really looked down the line, if you will, saw the future and said, there's a need for something like this. So Docker was already out there, and Google engineered Kubernetes, which is it's container orchestration. The best description I've heard for layman's terms is to say that with Kubernetes, every little system process that a computer does is wrapped in a little container. So typically applications are monolithic, like your operating system is running some big application like SAP, an ERP system, something like that. They call it monolithic. So it's one big app with lots of code that does all kinds of different things. Well, Kubernetes came along and said, no, let's divide that up into lots of little mini bits of functionality that will be delivered as needed via containers. So it's a very interesting approach, and it frankly exploded across the enterprise and created a whole lot of challenges, but of course offered a whole lot of benefit. And I would argue that this whole observability craze we've seen in the last 3, 4 years is as a direct result of Kubernetes. Because with Kubernetes now, we're able to see into so many other different parts of the stack, of the technology stack, and pull feeds to understand what's happening, because that's what it boils down to with observability. Is you're trying to see what's happening in the stack, what's happening in our environment, and be able to piece that together. Well, it's like it's great that we have all this information now, but someone has to put it all together. So there are developer portals. A company that we've done some work with lately or talked to is Cortex. They do some interesting work there. Backstage is another. There's a lot of these different environments where developers can kind of log in and get information about which of their projects has hit a snag, where is that snag, what they should they be working on today. This is all really important stuff to figure out, because developers cost money. Development costs money, takes time, and it's really important stuff. So what are you people working on? It's good to know all that kind of stuff, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we'll be hearing from Divanny Lamas from Transposit and Mohan Atreya from Rafay Systems. And ladies first, I'll throw it over to Divanny first. You've been in the space for a while doing some really interesting work. Tell us a bit about Transposit and how you're helping optimize ops.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. So I'm the CEO of Transposit, and at Transposit, we're building a new type of observability. So what we do is we extract intelligence out of untapped sources of knowledge that exist in every company. So think things like conversations that happen in chat like Slack, phone calls around incidents, emails, kind of run books that are in Confluence, notes from PRs and GitHub, and so on and so forth. So, kind of unlike traditional observability tools that are really focused on logs, metrics, and traces, our focus is really on kind of the rest of all of that context that tells us beyond the what of what is happening to the why of why it's happening. And customers typically use us to help reduce MTTR, solve incidents faster, get the right people into the room when something goes bump in the night, and to help, kind of take junior team members and bring up the overall ability of the team, right? Like people tend to say with Transposit, you can take someone who's been at the company for 2 weeks and make them as effective as someone who's been at the company for 15 years.
Wow. And how do you do that? So if you're talking about scraping from phone calls and emails and basically unstructured data, so you're capturing that unstructured data, and I'm guessing you're using some AI to parse what it means and use that insight then to develop playbooks for how people can address issues. Is that right? So you're basically using unstructured information to better understand what's happening with some issue, a bug or downtime or whatever, and you're using that to create insights which can then be leveraged in the future by other developers. Is that right?
That's totally right. Yeah. So what we do is we have a data platform that can ingest from tons of different sources. We have hundreds of different integrations, and then we use AI quite extensively. AI is really, really good at kind of just unstructured text, natural language, all those types of things. So we develop custom models for each of our customers and companies, and basically build out a graph of all of their words, their nouns, right? So their services, their teams, their people. And we use AI on top of that to provide a co-pilot style experience that will do things like enrich alerts. Like, hey, we just got this alert. How have we handled it in the past? What incidents have arisen from this? Do we see anything in some of our data sources that we're ingesting that might help us get to root cause faster? And yeah, we've been at it for quite some time now, and started off as a runbook automation builder, and we've really embraced AI completely in our world. We think it's a really big part of where ops is evolving.
That is very cool because we were just talking about this before the show. In the world of being a developer, well, first of all, the landscape is so much more complex than it was 10 years ago. I mean, you could argue even 5 years ago, the landscape, in other words, like you think, like even 15 years ago working in .NET, it was complex then. It was nowhere near as complex as it is today with all the different systems, all the different languages that you can use, the the prevalence of cloud as a de facto center of gravity, but all this on-prem stuff that's still sticking around. I mean, there are all these challenges that you have to deal with. And from a developer perspective, there's so much context that you need to understand, whether it be the systems that you're using, the infrastructure that's underpinning it, the business systems that you're hitting. I mean, there are all of these different component parts that have to come together. And a lot of that is captured in the unstructured information. So the emails going back and forth, calls. So the fact that you can pick that stuff up and leverage it, that's gold dust, right?
Yeah, I tell people, I really think operations is at a crisis point right now. Environments are so complex that no single person in an organization is ever going to be able to understand everything. And I think the part that's terrifying is that AI is going to make it more complex, right? Because now we have so much code being generated. We were talking before we started about how AI can generate so much code. The challenge is that code is now less understood than it's ever been before, right? So we've got this situation, it's already at this tipping point, and now you're adding more fuel to the fire. Teams aren't growing as quickly as they were. So you have this real challenge with tribal knowledge, right? And the problem is that no one's writing documentation. things are moving too fast to create documentation, so it's out of date the second that you write it.
Wow,
And
right.
what we find is when you look at, kind of like your Bob, right? Like the person at your company that happens to know where all the bodies are buried, always knows how to debug things. How do they do what they do? Well, they sit there, they watch all the Slack channels, they've been on all the incident calls, they review all the PRs, they happen to know that context of where everything is, but that knowledge, that data, that's not in logs. I was at Splunk for a really long time and ran the product team there. Like I think we made a lot of progress, but like it's not in the logs, it's not in the metrics, it's not in the traces, it's in the human conversations. So that's where we focus. We see a lot of gold there, we see a lot of context there. But we think you need AI to be able to sift through, kind of the amount of conversation and communication that's going on.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I like the way you mentioned the fact that the so-called full stack developer, that was the person who would understand everything, right? Who could just okay, is this the infrastructure? Is it the environment that we're in? What did we roll out recently? I mean, there are so many factors and so many moving parts. We were talking about teams of 300 developers. When you have 200 developers, I mean, how many teams is that? Is it 30 teams? Is it 40 teams? That's a lot of different teams that then have to coordinate with each other. Now, granted, there are tools to make that a lot easier these days, right? I mean, we did a show the other day with the folks from Zerv. I don't know if you came across them yet, but really interesting environment for building out solutions where every little block has its own kernel, right? So there's Docker underneath. Every block has its own kernel, and you could pull the code in and then just watch as any change happens, the other blocks change colors, and that's really good stuff to be able to see. All right, something has been impacted upstream that's going to affect me downstream. The visual stuff, that's really important, right? To be able to see
Yeah.
what's happening and kind of map it all together in your head, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're kind of in a golden age of tooling right now where there's just so many different approaches that people are taking, whether it's like, completely shifted left from the, kind of design perspective and having more guardrails around design. I'm sure Mohan will talk to us a little bit about that phase of it because I think it's a really critical piece here. And then, kind of tools that are really looking more at the system level kind of integration points. But what I tell people is we've had the promise of perfect service catalogs and CMDBs for a really long time, right? And the reality is that there will always be changes that will be made that are going to not get caught by structured processes, right? Because while processes exist to give us blessed ways of doing things, sometimes things happen outside of that process. And when things happen outside of that process, we still need visibility into that change. And sometimes the only visibility that we have into that change that happened is comments and code in a PR. It's, kind of things that were mentioned in a Slack channel or on a phone call. It's like really, really amorphous. So, I really think that teams today, when they're trying to answer questions like who should be in the room to solve a particular problem
Hmm.
and where should we start looking, they need to be able to tap into kind of their organization's institutional memory to be able to solve those problems faster. And we think that problem and really filling that observability gap, because that's what I talk to people about, right? Like there's ultimately a gap in your observability today because observability isn't regardless of what the vendors want to tell you, it's not being great at logs, it's not being great at metrics, it's not being great at traces, right? It's being really, really good at understanding the state of your systems at any given time and where things might be going wrong. And for that, you just got to really like open the aperture and start looking at data sources that you may not have traditionally thought of as observability data sources.
Interesting. That's very cool stuff. It's actually a good segue to bring in Mohan from Rafay Systems. Mohan, welcome to DM Radio. Tell us a bit about yourself and where you fit in this whole observability, AI enhancing ops kind of space.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I lead products and solutions at a company called Rafay Systems. We are about 6 years in as a company, and we predominantly sell to enterprises who have complex infrastructure and have a desperate need for automation. And they're trying to scale. They're trying to move fast. They're trying to do things efficiently with fewer people, especially in today's economy. And those are our typical customers. Now, in terms of your question on AI and other things, absolutely. I mean, this the general feeling is it's going to be a game changer. It may not necessarily, at least our thinking is not going to necessarily replace people, at least not near term, but it's going to give them significant powers, right? They can essentially translating that into productivity, right? That they can do things that they could not envision doing before, maybe be 2x productive, 3x productive, and that'll be nice because it removes drudgery from the process to the extent possible. At least that's kind of what we feel will happen near term. And that's kind of what we are optimizing our product to do as well. Is in we all ourselves realize that things we took for granted, which were like, you got to do this, like 20 steps. What if we embed AI in the process, and if it kind of does it for you, it learns from you, it learns from someone who has done something and is able to repeat that and templatize that? Wouldn't that be nice? Instead of having to get everyone to learn the ABCs and do a PhD in that particular area, right? That's this. Essentially, what that means, Eric, is if you know how to do certain things well, what if I can take over your strengths and literally, mind meld, and I can do what you're doing, Eric, because AI is helping me do that to the extent possible. So that's what we see in the market, and that's what we're responding to, at least from an AI perspective.
Well, when I think about the power of AI here, and I think again we're at the very early stages of this, but I've played around with it quite a bit, and it's amazing what has been captured by these LLMs. There's a tremendous amount of information in there, and of course the engine itself, its ability to parse and then reflect back what it thinks you want to see. And granted, it is just weightings; it's just a reflection that comes based from your prompt combined with its engine and how it does similarity matches, basically of vectors. That's what it really boils down to, is similarity searches of vectors. But it's really good. And it's just like, wow, how did it know all that stuff? It's kind of freaky. And as I think to myself, we were talking with Divanny about Transposit and what they're doing, capturing all this information. If you have your own private instance of an LLM, I think most organizations are going to have one, and you start feeding it all sorts of embeddings about everything you've seen in your playbook, pretty soon it's going to get real good. And it's going to be your super all-star intern who knows all kind of stuff about what's happening. And you'll just ask it, hey, our system just went down. What's going on out there? And it'll like think and think and think and go, up, check this, check that. I have to think that's going to happen. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, we already see that happening to an extent. It's transforming processes.
Our commercial break is coming. I was talking too much. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, having a fantastic conversation with Divanny Lamas of Transposit and Mohan Atreya from Rafay Systems. And Mohan, we hit the break when you were in stride there, so my apologies, but see if you can hop back on the horse and take it from where you just were. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think we were starting to talk about AI and how transformative it could be. The break actually kind of gave me some time to kind of collect the thoughts. So maybe a good way to think about this is maybe take some examples, right? So the AI and Gen AI in particular has been kind of like a flashy new topic for the last 12 months or so. But people have been doing AI for a crazy amount of time. Some of our customers in the healthcare space, and we also work very closely with NVIDIA as an example, when they kind of dominate this space, right? And when you go talk to people there, they would talk about tech that do not make press today, right? Because they're so used to working with AI tech that, and I would call that ancient by today's term. Right? They've been doing AI for 20 years, right? And the difference that I go to ask them what exactly it means, how to use it, what they come back and tell me is, look, we initially built AI to be consumed by machines and systems, right? And today, what has happened with Gen AI is, we think about large language model. Language is something humans understand. Computers don't care about it. Computers can talk in bits and bytes, and they'll be happy, perfectly happy, right? So there's been this translation that's been happening so that it can be consumed by human beings, right? Whether it's a visual, like generating a movie or generating music or something like that. Only humans care about it, not systems. So we see this interesting fragmentation happening in the market there. This, what I call is traditional AI, which has been done for a long time. It continues to evolve. And now the interesting question that is happening is, now they're thinking, how do I overlay this Gen AI? Does it give me something transformative that maybe I didn't think about before, right? So machine consumable data, how do I take that and maybe make a user go faster? Make the user do things that they couldn't do before, right? Like I'll give an example. The way I do blogs these days, right? I walk around, I write, I don't write the raw material. I talk to Google, and it's just a stream of consciousness that I'm dumping into a Google Doc, right? It's unstructured, maybe badly written because it's a stream of consciousness. Then you go to ChatGPT or Bard or one of those LLMs that exist and say, can you please rewrite this with a certain tone? And it'll do the job. And that's my, that's maybe saving hours of my time as a consumer, right? As a user of that tech. Now I can do more of that in a day than I could do before. That's a superpower for me that I didn't have before. And the same thing with visuals. You draw something and you say, hey, can you redraw this with the right icons for a certain architecture? It'll do it for me. Ain't that cool? I mean, instead of me spending hours doing it in some productivity tool. I think this is the near-term opportunity we're seeing, where people are seeing tangible, immediate results. Because in the end, organizations, they're saying, look, I'll spend money on this thing if you can demonstrate there are tangible results with productivity or something like that. Where will this evolve? I guess we'll all have to wait and watch. But near term, this is what I'm seeing, where it's really not replacing people, it's making people do more things, making people do things more efficiently, which they couldn't do before.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I think that it makes every developer a 10x developer. It makes every writer a 10x writer, basically. I mean, we've heard all about the 10x developer. That's the person who's really sharp, who works hard, but keeps an open mind, right? And I'll throw one of my favorite developer mantras over to you. My good buddy, who is a developer, has this great line. I want to get your take on it, and maybe we'll get Divanny to get her take too. He says, busy is the enemy of creative. What do you think about that?
You want to take that and I'll add to that? Or I can start. Yeah,
you start. You start, and then
okay.
Divanny.
Yeah, it's like you've been reading my mind, because it's exactly the conversation I had before this. So we use this term inside called good busy, bad busy, right?
I like that.
It's a variation of that.
Good busy, bad busy. That's fun.
Yeah, the bad busy is if you're on a hamster wheel, and you're not really making progress, and perhaps even taking a few steps behind, right? I mean, you're just doing a lot of things, right? Not really moving the needle. And the good busy is what we all want to get to, where we feel productive, where we take things to the next level. And I think this is where, again, if we guys don't make that conscious shift, I think we are all going to be in trouble, right? In the sense, I mean, our jobs will be gone to a different kind of a persona, and we can actually see this among generational changes that happen, right? Like when you talk to someone who maybe is not as well versed with certain technology, they are in essence maybe not as productive in a job as another person who is well versed in technology could be, right? And now, how do you upskill? So I think this AI thing, again, like I mentioned, is more of an upskill thing. If you don't latch on and run with it, I think we'll all be outdated. It's a warning. We have some time now. We got to retool, or we're left behind.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And you know, I'll say this, Divanny, I'll throw it over to you to comment on that. Good is the enemy of creative, but also I think we are going to see a wholesale transformation of the enterprise technology stack. I think that LLMs are going to be infused in just about everything. And if you're not, as a product developer, thinking about how to work some of this stuff into the mix, your product probably isn't going to last very long, just because there's no reason to reinvent wheels, right? And when someone comes along and creates an engine like this, which Steve Lucas of Boomi was joking, for, practically free, for practically no money, you can upskill everyone in your organization. Why would you not use that kind of a technology? I feel it is going to be almost like a new application fabric or a new standard to leverage these things. What do you think, Tabani?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to comment on your question earlier. I think that a good engineer is a lazy engineer, right? And I actually disagree that that you're going to see every engineer become a 10x engineer, because I do think that we're seeing a real sort of I'd say bifurcation of how people are approaching AI. And I think some people are embracing it, and some people are not, right? Like any new technology, you're always going to have laggards. And we're very much in a scenario where, kind of the thing to be afraid of isn't AI taking your job. It's someone using AI taking your job.
Right.
And so what I'm seeing is great engineers becoming 100x engineers.
Wow.
And it's amazing to watch that. And I think it's because some people are adopting it into their own tooling and really changing the way that they approach systems design. It's just a matter of time before the fundamental architectures of everything we do shift because of these new AI technologies. And kind of we're fortunate as a startup to be able to really kind of rethink our architecture to be AI native, right? And that's something that we've taken very seriously, right? Like it's easy to get stuck in that innovator's dilemma where you're like, well, I'm going to slowly bite at this. But I see the big kind of big companies right now that are adopting AI at like record speed. And for me, it's like, it's not really a case of like, do I want to start using AI? It's like, do I want to survive as a
Right.
company? And if I want
Right.
to survive as a company, and if I want to survive, kind of in my career, then I think every individual and every leader really needs to be thinking about how does AI fit into their environment. And so, yeah, I think that on the technical side, you're going to see it in all of the tools and infrastructure that we build. But I think that the really cool thing that's going on is this like weird blurring of category lines, right? So like,
I like
news,
that.
there's like big news out of Snowflake, right? Frank Slootman stepping down and new CEO. And in full disclosure, I was a managing director at Sutter Hill Ventures, which is the VC that incubated Snowflake. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about Snowflake and thinking about the BI space and the data space in general. So, I think there's no question that the data warehouses have done very well for themselves, and that there's a few winners. But you look at Microsoft, and Microsoft has, I think, seeded the battle, right? They accept that they don't have really a strong player in the data warehouse world. So what have they done? They launch Fabric, right? And Fabric is like business objects redux. It's really moving the value up the stack. And you see this like blurring starting to happen around BI and warehouses and databases. And so unsurprisingly, Snowflake is also investing really heavily into moving up the stack getting more of that end user experience. And I don't think it's a surprise that the new CEO has search experience and has very, very strong AI experience, because enterprise search and unstructured data are two of the fastest growing elements in the data ecosystem. So, kind of that's adjacent to ops, but I think that you're going to see the exact same thing in every single category in our world. So, I talked about observability. I see a big blurring happening in the observability world. I think that you're going to see that same blurring happening in, kind of different layers of infrastructure, in management tooling around things. And I can't predict where all of these different categories and things are going to end up, but I do know that AI is going to play a really significant role. And if I were to venture a guess, I think a lot of what we're going to see is a shift in how we think about the boundaries of applications, moving from, kind of the software that's enabling the humans to taking over more and more of the tasks that would have traditionally been done by humans. Because while it's still early in ops to say that we're replacing humans, we're definitely replacing roles, right? One of the things that our product does is we have a scribe. So we have a scribe that'll sit there and it'll take notes for you, right? And we have a thing that will connect to any of your Zoom conferences or other video conferences. And it takes notes, it creates summaries of those notes, it sends them out to people. And after the fact, it creates a post-incident review, right? And the quality of these things is outstanding, right? Like we've done the analysis on what percentage of people are actually shifting the things that are on there, and it's like less than a 5% correction rate on any of the individual summaries that we're building out. And like, we're building like tons of summaries. You can imagine like a multi-day incident. These things are pretty noisy, right? So what does that mean for people whose job was incident scribe? Like you guys may be thinking about modern teams. There's not that many people these days, but back in the NOC days, and some people still have NOCs, there were people whose dedicated job was incident scribe. So that role is going away. I think it's an opportunity because you can find way more creative work for people to do that's going to help move, kind of the top line for businesses, which everyone's looking for those opportunities. But, the shift is coming. It's coming at the technology level, but it's also coming at the, kind of like what apps decide to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in what you just said there. And, I've seen some of these things like there's Otter and there's Fireflies and there's some of these other things. There's Gong, which I believe is, capturing the sentiment on some of these calls. And it's freaky. Like when you go back and you read through what was discussed in the meeting and you realize how accurately it's depicted in this text, it's like, holy Christmas. I mean, that's something you don't want to let go of. You want to be able to have that all the time for every meeting and then be able to go through. Now, I didn't remember hearing that in the meeting, really, because it's right here at 32 minutes and 27 seconds. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's what you're talking about. It basically holds people accountable more effectively, I think is what it boils down to. But it also provides this treasure trove of information, so you know what was there. And we have our next break coming up here, but I'd love to keep you guys for another 10 segments here because we can get into all kind of fun stuff about optimizing the processes of ops that underpin ops. And that's kind of what we're talking about. And you both, of course, are in the automation space. So anything you can automate, you should automate. Now, you always want the manual override, as it were. You want to be able to toggle on and off to using this AI, for example. And when it starts going wonky, toggle it off. Hold on, let's go back to the old way of doing things, people. Let's figure this out. That's what Google just did with their image generator. I mean, what a huge blunder that was for Google of all companies to just come in and like boom, and like, all right, well, turn that thing off. Like, what? It was on for a few days and it just shit hit the fan. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back with a fantastic conversation here. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to a couple real experts in the field of ops, Divanny Lamas of Transposit and Mohan Atreya of Rafay Systems. And Mohan, I'll throw it over to you. We were just chatting in the break about how amazing these technologies are right now, these large language models. And of course, well, I won't say they're, of course, getting better because they are getting worse in some ways. And there are some really interesting issues going on. I've got a good buddy, Sean Brem from CrowdPoint Technologies. He actually was telling me he saw this coming. He looked at their models and before he had to sign an NDA, and that time passed. So now you can talk about it. He said he looked at their models 3 years ago and said, "Oh, this is going to collapse." He said, "You're going to have long-term memory problems. You're not appreciating entropy in the systems, and it's going to fall apart." And they're like, "Ah, well, why don't you just be quiet and go away?" And so he did. But it does have it's, I mean, this is such an unwieldy system. My buddy, Dr. Osama Fayyad, made this joke on the show at the beginning of this year. He goes, "Well, first of all, the models are too big. There's no reason why these models should work. They're too big. No one understands why they work." I thought that was funny. An honest commentary there from an expert in the field who's been doing this for a long, long, long time. So machine learning, we need to learn how the machines learn, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of time spent in us just trying to figure out how this stuff works and sort of interpret and parse what's going on here. And of course, it changes all the time. I mean, I'm one for saying that Congress probably should act and there should be transparency in how these models work because they're so powerful. I'm not sure we can rely on the old argument that, oh, it's proprietary and it's just up to them. But I don't know, maybe let's dive into that wormhole. What do you think, Mohan? Should these models be transparent? I know with Meta, Llama is open source, right? But ChatGPT is a black box right now. What do you think, Mohan?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question because I can argue both ways. But in general, philosophically, I think both should be allowed to exist, and we'll see who wins out in the end commercially. I mean, I'm a believer in that model that the market will vote eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the good thing about open source models is they are incredibly close to what these closed source models appear to be in terms of performance and capability and all of that. That puts downward pressure on things like pricing because you don't have to pay people can't lock you out, right? Like tomorrow, if ChatGPT or OpenAI or someone comes and says, "I'm not going to do business with you," what does this company have at that point of time? Nothing, right? So the open source model there, which is maybe as good, at least gives them an option.
Mm-hmm.
So at least no one's got a stranglehold on this technology, right? I think that's the power of open source. But it does take a lot of effort to run this yourself. It's not for the mortals, right? It's just infinitely easier to simply say, "Hey, I'm going to pay by the token to OpenAI and let it do its magic," right? And if I don't like it, sure, I'll go to an alternative, right? There's a million other options that exist at this point of time. I think eventually it'll collapse into a few really good ones, and there'll be probably vertical focused models that maybe something for healthcare that understands healthcare really well. We'll see. Maybe the jury's out on that too. I think the last thing we should hope for is a regulation in this space, at least not now. I think it'll stifle innovation at this juncture. Yeah, the technology is so crazy inside it. I don't, like you said, I think people don't know how to explain how it works. It just seems to work like magic, and it's scary. And there are very few people who understand the math behind it and the logic behind it. Yeah, that's a hard situation. I think legislation is the wrong answer right now.
Yeah,
maybe in the future, once it hopefully hopefully we won't be in a situation where it's too late. We'll see.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and Divanny, I'll throw this one over to you. We've talked a lot about RAG models, and I think that is where all the energy is going to be placed, is really fine-tuning the RAG models and understanding the differences between these large language models. And there are differences in how they work, how they approach the responses that they give you. And one thing I thought was very interesting, we had co-founder of Kong on the show, I guess a week or two ago, and he was talking about how they have a new AI API solution where you can actually embed your guardrails into the API gateway, which I found very interesting because a lot of people, unless you have an in-house large language model, which is pretty rare. You're going to be hitting these things through the internet. So to bake into your gateway some of these rules like no politics, for example. I asked Bard the other day, hey, how many delegates or how many electoral votes do these different states have? And it thought for a second and said, elections are very complex, and we recommend you use Google for that. I was like, that's a guardrail. They're like, no, don't touch politics. It's too dangerous. But what do you think about that, Divanny, that, here a gateway, an API gateway can be part of your RAG model? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that guardrails are a really important question. I think whether it's topical types of guardrails, but I think that beyond that, the power of RAG is really to be able to extend the models that you're using to a company's data, right? And I think that that's kind of where the next big leap is, because right now you can go to ChatGPT, you can ask it to generate a runbook for you. All right, it might be useful. It might give you some guidance on typical ways that people debug issues that are similar to what you're describing. But there's so much more context within the organization in terms of the
Right.
specific systems and tools. And so more and more, you're going to see people asking, how do we extend these models to work on our data? And to understand our context, to understand, another example I like to give people is, kind of say that you have a service at your company called the Cadillac service, and it's a database, and you want to ask a question, how do we debug Cadillac? Well, if you ask ChatGPT, it's going to tell you go check the oil first. And that's not going to be very helpful, right? So we need to teach these models to understand how we work and how our companies work and our terminology. RAG is the approach for that. However, the second you start talking about pulling together all of a company's data into one place and then throwing AI on top of it, eyebrows go up, right? It's a big topic for governance teams and security teams right now around how do we put the right sane set of controls on these systems so that we can explore and invest. It's not that companies don't want the capabilities, it's that they know that there has to be a rational approach. And so, right now, I think the approach is that every single company that's building a RAG pipeline really needs to think about pre-processing steps within that RAG pipeline to do anything from, kind of PII removal to anonymization of kind of relevant data, credit card numbers, things like that. That's kind of like level zero. But it's going to expand from there, right? Like companies are going to have specific things that they want to do in terms of not unifying certain data sets, right? Like you look at a healthcare company, and there's lots of research that has been done in terms of how you can do de-anonymization when you bring multiple different data sets. And, data science teams have known about these policies and these regulations for a while, so they've been able to follow those when they're doing their analytics. But what happens when you can offer up those analytics to anyone in the company? And LLMs are fabulous at finding relationships. So, I throw in my CRM data, and then I also throw in some test data, and all of a sudden it's able to figure out who has diabetes in a particular reservation because there's one person, right? So I think there's just like a lot of hairy problems around kind of data and data guardrails and data quality guardrails and questions, and we're just starting to explore all of this. It's kind of very early days.
Well, I mean, you made a couple really interesting points there, and I have to say, I would probably want to do a whole show on this topic, but you think about what these LLMs can do, and you mentioned, for example, finding pattern. That's what they do, is it's pattern analysis, right? When you vectorize content, it's a vector, it's a point and a trajectory, and it's stored in a database or in the model. You can store it in the model too, but these similarity searches are what are generating the text that you ultimately see, right? So it's seen so many patterns. It's seen countless patterns. I mean, I literally don't think you can count the patterns that these things have seen. And you're talking about 1 billion parameters. I mean, it's just crazy complex. And I'm thinking to myself, it's going to become a significant part of many different workflows. So you think you kind of hinted at Snowflake and the changes going on over there. Again, I mentioned this epiphany. I'm like, well, LLMs don't care about inner joins and outer joins. And I think about the amount of heavy lifting that's been done over the years in data warehousing, picking up data, moving it over here, and now moving it over there. All these ETL scripts. I mean, no kidding. In the earliest days of DM radio, I thought to myself, that madness has got to stop. I mean, you guys are moving so much data, only 5 to 10% of which really ever gets used. So it's like, where is all that cost going to go? And I think what's going to happen is it's going to change. You're going to have massive architectural shifts going on. But we'll leave that for the podcast bonus segment, folks. Coming up next, you are listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on A Great DM Radio with Divanny Lamas of Transposit and Mohan Atreya of Rafay Systems. And, you got me all excited there in the last segment, Divanny, so I blame you for this hard question. But seriously, I think to myself, machine to machine conversation to the human being is very complex. So the machines is pretty simple. And if you break it down like to the number of different log files that you can see, it's actually less complex than human language or French language or other languages. So I wonder to myself, are we going to be able to use these LLMs to look at things like network traffic and understand how to optimize that, to look at supply chain issues and understand how to optimize that? I think that the all bets are off in terms of what's possible, but what are you thinking? What's practical? How should organizations go about using these new tools to optimize ops?
I mean, I think that there's so much opportunity that it's hard to pick a place to start. But I'll give a framework, right? So when I look at LLMs and I think about what are good places to go, I look at a couple of things. First, I look at things that have never been possible before, right? So like, let's not look at optimizing. Let's look at what are tasks that we just could not do in the past. And then the other thing I look at is what are traditional computing problems that felt like they were really, 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 really hard to do? And do LLMs offer a new approach that solves that problem in a dramatically easier way? One great example is like, I think enterprise search is about to have a renaissance. Search was historically such a hard problem. I remember being at Google and we were working on the search appliance for enterprise. We had to stop building it and selling it because it was just so hard to implement and get it working at people's companies, right? Whereas now, I think that you see enterprise search and it's just kind of so much easier to solve that class of computing problems. So I think within there, there's a lot of rich ground. We're looking a lot at kind of new data sources, right? That's one good example. LLMs are fabulous at ETL. So if you've had a particularly challenging ETL problem in the past, LLMs are a really great thing to put towards that.
Yeah, I did that.
But at the end, yeah, like regexes, right? Never write a regex again. But at the end of the day, I think it's really gonna vary company by company, and like the most important thing is just have fun with it and be creative and let yourself try things that feel like they just won't work because you might be surprised.
That's a really good way to put it too, because you might be surprised. And it's fun to hear you say that about the difficulty of getting search to work. Because one of my theories years ago was that chatbots became so popular a bit too early, to be honest, but they became so popular because search on websites was horrible. I mean, Google search is good because they got a whole bunch of engineers focused on that. But when you would have a search on a particular, like a domain, like some URL of, XYZ Corporation, the search results sucked. They were horrible. You would try to find something, you get press releases and all this meaningless nonsense. I'm like, I don't want any of that crap. It was just completely useless. So I'm not surprised to hear that story. That's kind of funny. Well, Mohan, I'll throw it over to you. What's your advice on companies finding useful ways to leverage these technologies?
Yeah. So I have a slightly different perspective on this, predominantly because I think we are right now with this technology, what I'll call is effectively a kindergarten as a state of mind, right? and I'll explain why. everyone talks about how LLM has transformed things and all of that, but it's been predominantly been, the success stories have been with what I would call as public data, right? Like anything that's available to anyone,
Right.
stuff you'd find on a Google search.
Right.
And sure, some of that has come into an enterprise, but there we've hit some interesting roadblocks. The roadblocks are, in any organization, not all data is meant to be consumed by everybody. So what you don't want is the LLM to leak unintended data
Sure.
or insights, right? So if you have an LLM that's parsing revenue data and you're a public company, and if someone searches some results and if it leaks where we are for the next quarter, well, that's a problem. It'll result in all kind of challenges. So now what people are in effect doing is saying, look, I'm gonna put a couple of handcuffs on this LLM. I'll only allow you to see this data, not that data. Then you have to figure out, well, who am I going to expose it to? Identity becomes a problem. Identity and role in the company becomes a problem. It's the same thing with like doctors. Like, sure, maybe in medicine, maybe I'll have an LLM look at stuff, but what do you want that person to see? Everything? Well, that may be dangerous. So how do you put some guardrails around this? I think we don't know yet, right? I think people are still trying to figure that out. I think that, unfortunately, will become it's not a technology problem per se. I think it's also a human problem,
Right.
Because it's a decision people have to make, and there are going to be unintended consequences. I think there's going to be some fallouts here and there. Maybe people will get hauled up in front of Congress, and God knows what will happen in that space, right?
Right.
Yeah, so that's I think that's why I kind of called it like we are in early stages. It's beautiful for scenarios when you're using it in a specific domain where everyone there has access to that data. It gives you the superpower. Or it's on internet kind of data, public data that everyone has access to, and it just lets you do your job faster. Beyond that, where you have these walls and boundaries, how do you avoid the contamination of insights? Don't know yet.
Right. I think you're exactly right. It's going to be a wild and woolly world coming down the pike at us pretty quickly too. And I look at it, I think the ultimate vision in the future is going to be an LLM powered interface for executives first, but then for people throughout the company that is tapped into maybe via a RAG model, the data that is relevant to them, such that a CEO could just sit there and say, how can I improve my business? Who should I hire next? Who should I fire to curb costs or something like that? Not that you have to use everything it says, but just to get insights from it, because if it can see everything, I mean, goodness gracious, these things are very powerful. And I don't think we're anywhere near fully understanding just how they'll be able to analyze and understand things. And here's my last point I'll make. I want to understand how it chooses the bits that it chooses when it creates the answer. That's the big question in my mind. And I understand it's a question of weightings and aligning similarities and so forth, but still, it's pretty interesting the stuff that it decides to serve up to you and deliver. And usually it's very good. I think the rumors about the hallucinations, yes, there are some, but I think they're getting overplayed mostly out of fear because people are afraid of losing their jobs, even people in the media, and they should be, because that is in the crosshairs as well. But folks, look these two folks up online, Divanny Lamas of Transposit and Mohan Atreya from Rafay Systems. You've been listening to DM Radio.